Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. After 14 long years, we have Labour governments at either end of the M4, and tonight we are speaking to someone who knows an awful lot about Welsh Government and how two Labour governments in Wales and Westminster will interact. We are delighted to be joined by Professor Leighton Andrews, former Senate member for the Rhondda and Welsh Government Minister and author of Ministerial Leadership, Practice, Performance and Power. Hello, Leighton.
Hi there.
Thanks for joining us. Firstly, what we'll start off with is a little bit about you talking about your own experience of becoming a minister.
Well, it was shortly after 2007. I think I was on a train back from London. I got a message that Rhodri wanted to see me. I went in to see him. He was there with somebody called Mark Drakeford, I think, if I remember rightly, who was obviously then one of his senior special advisors. And he offered me the role of Deputy Minister um, for Social Justice with specific responsibility for housing. And of course, this was just after Welsh Labour had lost seats at the election. It was a minority government. Clearly, you know, Rhodri, the way things are, Rhodri was First Minister on election day. He carried on being First Minister. Therefore, he was in a position to appoint a number of ministers. So this would have been sometime after the May election, and I was brought in as a deputy minister, and I was in that role for 6 weeks or so, 7 weeks maybe, before we formed the One Wales government with Plaid Cymru when I moved from uh, the housing role to regeneration.
So, in your book, you talk about a famous quote from Virginia Bottomley about the type of ministers that people can be. Were you a window breaker or a glazier?
Uh, well, at that stage, I was just a deputy minister. So, in a sense, I think I was just finding my feet, really. And I mean, in the first 6, 7 weeks, getting used to where private office work, getting on top of the policy. I mean, I think I announced in the Senate that we would legislate to allow local government to levy additional council tax on second homes, for example. So at that stage, I don't think I was either, bluntly. I mean, when I was moved by Rhodri as the One Wales government was formed in, I guess, July, I was there to be deputy to both Brian Gibbons, Dr. Brian Gibbons, Social Justice Minister, and Ieuan Wyn-Jones as Deputy First Minister. And I was certainly there partly to keep an eye on Ieuan, I think.
You talk in your book about the fact that there's no guidebook, no manual, no training to becoming a minister. But what was your experience of learning to be a minister like?
Well, I suppose I'd had a slightly unusual background in that I'd spent a lot of my time in my working career from my early 20s based in London. And I'd been a sabbatical officer, national Youth students. So I'd been in meetings with ministers at the age of 22, I guess, in 1980. I was Age Concerns parliamentary officer. I was BBC's head of public affairs. So I'd had a lot of experience from the outside of meeting ministers, seeing them perform, and all those kind of things. And then, of course, as I say in the book, in 97, some of my friends became ministers in that Labour government. So I started to see a little bit of that from the from the outside. And then once the assembly was up and running, I had that experience of just watching it from outside, then as a backbencher, seeing ministers perform as well subsequently. So I got a bit of a kind of grounding. I felt, I'd seen ministers perform. I'd seen some things that I thought worked, some things that didn't work so well, and I had my own views about how that looked. But in terms of actually getting on with the job, I think the experience I'd had that was the most useful was working in the BBC in a large corporate organization as part of a large senior management team, where you get used to the fact that not everything you want to happen is going to happen. You have to work out the internal skills and office skills of working with others to achieve objectives. You're working within a very clear kind of corporate framework, clear kind of lines to take on issues and those kinds of things. So I think that was actually, and it's a big organization, so I think that was actually very good training.
One of the things I've been taken by since Keir Starmer has become Prime Minister is his approach to governmental leadership. I think this builds a lot on his experience as being a civil servant, as the Director of Public Prosecutions. But do you think that administrative element of ministerial leadership is overlooked by quite a lot of people going into the role?
Well, I think you have to have an idea of how to get things done. That's part of what it's about. And Keir Starmer is in an unusual position. He's someone who would have attended the weekly permanent secretaries meetings, for example, in Whitehall. So he has a good insider understanding of how senior civil servants work. And I think that's certainly beneficial to him. I think people very often do, and I talk about this in the book. You know, Patricia Hewitt, I think, particularly has a good account of prior to 1997 when they were organising some training sessions for shadow ministers at Templeton College in Oxford, how a number of the people on her team, ministerial team, just assumed that they would announce the policy, if you like, and then it would be implemented. When in practice, it's a lot more. There's a lot more to it than that. You've got to follow through on implementation. You've got to have clear understanding of what the critical paths are from a policy being announced. Maybe it goes through legislation to getting enacted on the ground, and then the reporting mechanisms to come back on all that. And not everybody necessarily has that experience or has that understanding before they become a minister.
Do you think that ministers kind of appreciate their role as a leader? Do you think they understand that aspect of it, or do they just think they've been a promoted politician?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I think unprompted, very, I reviewed about just under 150 interviews carried out for the Institute for Government, by the Institute for Government with former ministers, and they include ministers in devolved administrations as well as in the UK government. And unprompted, very few of them refer to leadership or being a leader. But in practice, that is what they are. And they are actively leaders in their departments. They don't run the department in a technical sense, in that the permanent secretary is the overall managerial leader, if you like. But they are also in certain situations, and this is true in Wales as well, say in the education or the health service, leaders of particular branches of the public service. They are system leaders, if you like, and that is a significant role. But as I say, very few talk about it in leadership terms, though they are, as I say in the book, practicing leadership in what they do every day.
Why do you think that is? Do you think it's just not is it, do you think, a deficit of training for politicians as they advance?
I think it depends on their prior roles, to be honest. I think people get made ministers for a variety of reasons, but on the whole, it's prior political activity that gets them into ministerial roles. But once they're in those roles, it's prior career activity, I think, that helps them deliver what they've got to do. And they rely on that kind of memory they have of previous jobs, previous job roles. Now, there are people who have been in leadership roles before going into politics. But most politicians who've come through, say, being a backbencher, have not actually run anything very much. On the other hand, you've got people who've been council leaders or trades union leaders like Alan Johnson, or have been chief executives in businesses or in the third sector, who do have that leadership experience and are able to talk about that. I think what really comes into play here is people's prior careers.
Do you think then that subject knowledge matters at all, or is it more a administrative leadership role? Because I was quite taken a few weeks ago by a discussion that Rory Stewart was having with Kwasi Kwarteng, where they were talking about how UK government ministerial roles are apportioned and how often people with incredible expertise, say in foreign affairs, end up going to work in DEFRA, for example. Do you think that it is management experience that is more important than maybe subject experience?
Rory Stewart wrote a great book, Politics on the Edge, which I thoroughly enjoyed and recommend. But one or two of the things that come through that book, I think, demonstrate a little naivety on his part at the beginning. He has this kind of discussion about going into Parliament as a fresh backbencher, thinking that his role as governor of a province in Iraq would put him in good stead to be a minister in the Foreign Office or something like that. And that's, not how politics works in practice. You are. It comes back to what I said. What gets you a ministerial role ultimately is political experience within a legislature or possibly outside if you've had for example, a leader of a council, something like that. And then you rely on the skills that you've had in jobs. There are examples of people with significant experience in, say, the health service who have become health ministers. I think of Sam Galbraith, for example, and Labour, who've been able to make a significant difference. But having sectoral experience doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a great minister. Some people can't break out of that role that they had before and see it on if they've worked in one part of a system, start to see it on a whole system basis. So I don't think, I think some people work well in that, some people don't. In an ideal world, you would hope people would get promoted a bit more because they have some knowledge of an area.
You mentioned health there, and I was fascinated by the discussion you had in the book about the sort of academic impression that some ministerial roles are gendered. What did you mean by this, and do you think it's still the case?
Well, there's a lot of very good writing now about women politicians, a lot of great feminist writing about women politicians, and increasingly writing about women ministers and the differences that they have brought. I think I quote this from one Labour minister who felt that the ministerial job had be really being created for a middle-aged man with a wife to keep the home running, as it were. And essentially what I'm saying, and I'm not, I'm just picking up on some very good work that's been done by other people, really, is that these institutions were created at a time when largely only men had these roles. And so women going into these roles are entering what are, by their very nature, gendered institutions. But there have been significant developments over recent years. And you do get a kind of sense, looking at the interviews with former women ministers, of a camaraderie between them, a sisterly solidarity, if you like, which goes across party. And I think there is a kind of gender emerging, which is much more geared to trying to ensure that the private offices are more respectful of family time, for example, of the realities of being a politician. And that I think is changing the institution as well in a very healthy way.
Again, I was very interested by the sort of the excerpt from I think it was Patricia Hewitt, talking about the fact that her health team was essentially all female, and she didn't want the health department to be a solely female organization. But I mean, it was traditionally the case, wasn't it, that certain departments seem to be given more often to women than men. Obviously, we've seen that be sort of changed dramatically in the last week or so with Rachel Reeves going into number 11. But that was historically the case, wasn't it?
Well, you'll find, I think there's an interview with Margaret Beckett, not for the Institute for Government, but an interview conducted by Peter Hennessy for Radio 4 originally, I think, where she talks about the way in which, it was assumed that women would be put into, I mean, maybe in Shirley Williams as well, health or education. These were seen as the female-friendly departments. But that has changed, radically. And Margaret Beckett, of course, was Foreign Secretary. Rachel Reeves is now the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So I think we're seeing quite a bit of movement there, and obviously not before time.
I mean, going back to the politics of it all for a second, obviously the Labour Party has struggled to see women elected as leaders, and like we said, that is changing somewhat with in senior roles with people like Rachel Reeves, Angela Rayner.
I think there is still something in the culture of Labourism that derives from um, the old trade union movement as it was, which was very much about the notion of the family wage, the male breadwinner earning a wage from the entire family. That was deep in the culture for a long time. I think it's changed, it is changing and it's been changing over these last 20, 25 years, but it's changing far too slowly.
I mean, you talk a little bit, I think, about sort of macho cultures of government. It seems that the parties that tend to form the governments also tend to replicate a little bit of that approach.
I think the institutions reflect that. Harriet Harman talks quite a lot about that in her interview, and I quote from her. And these things are historic. They are deeply rooted. They don't change easily, and they require continued pressure to make them change. I talk about ministers coming into their roles and having essentially to remind the private offices that they are not just ministers. They are also family members. They are also um, constituency representatives. They are also party representatives. And these are things that are kind of alien to the civil service in a way, in the way it's prepared the ground for ministers in the past. And making institutional changes doesn't happen quickly.
So obviously, you've been a minister in Wales, and you've got quite a lot of experience of working with ministers at Westminster. How would you compare those different experiences, those different types of ministerial governments?
There are a number of ways of looking at this, aren't there, really? I mean, if you're a minister at Westminster, you're either in the Lords or the Commons, you've got a much bigger legislature you're dealing with. The workload in certain respects, correspondence, for example, is going to be heavier. But on the other hand, ministerial correspondence is heavier for some departments in the Welsh Government than others. The Health Minister, I can remember seeing the sheaves of the correspondence that Leslie Griffiths had to deal with when she was Health Minister and I was Education Minister. I had quite a lot as Education Minister, but nothing like what the Health Minister had. So there are differences between departments. If you're in a foreign service or defence role at Westminster, the odds are you're going to be spending quite a lot of your time overseas. That isn't the same in the Welsh Government. Although, Alan Davis would tell you that when he was Agriculture Minister, and we were in the European Union, he was probably on the train to Brussels, once a week. But there are kind of structural differences like that, which are very evident. I still think, of course, Whitehall has not really got its head round devolution. Ministers who are becoming education or health ministers are at Westminster are essentially ministers for England. They may have the occasional UK role, and that isn't necessarily recognised still, I would say, as time, and then we saw that most obviously in the pandemic, when there was actual shock, I think, on the Conservative benches at the power that Mark Drakeford had, the power that Nicola Sturgeon had in respect of the way in which they were handling the pandemic. I think the other thing, of course, is that with the exception of, I think I was going to say this, but this is not fair because it's, members from North Wales have to travel a long way down to Cardiff for the week. The workload in the institution, the legislative institution, can be different. The other thing I'd say about the difference between ministers in Westminster and in Wales is that in Wales, all the ministers are based on the same floor, fifth floor in the Senedd building. Some may have offices as well in Cathays Park. Whereas in Whitehall, they are based within their departments, within their own baronies, as it were, and that is a significant difference. You would assume that the Welsh system would make for more harmonious collaborative and cooperative working. Certainly, it ought to be a way of getting decisions made more quickly. So these are some of the differences I note.
In your book, you'd say that the Welsh government was still built around the Westminster model, though, when it was established. Would you mind explaining a little bit about that?
Yes. I guess from the beginning, there was nothing really to go on, in terms of what a Welsh government would look like. And it wasn't until very late on, even in the early legislation, that there was a move from a local government model, a hybrid model, if you like, to a model that recognised there would be an executive or cabinet. In the early days, there was quite a lot of resistance, as we know now from the published UK cabinet files, to even the title of minister being used in Wales. And that was overcome by Rhodri in a kind of discursive coup d'etat, if you like, in 2000, as he said he wanted, he thought people would understand what the title minister was, but not so much secretary. But you have that structure, and I think you had the structure of well, there were some quite interesting things that I've learned from talking to one or two people. At one point it was envisaged that ministers in the assembly would sit at the front, facing the rest of the chamber, which was a kind of bizarre proposition. So they had to find models on which to build. So I would say that the cabinet agenda probably derives to a degree from Westminster agendas. You start with the First Minister's items. Prime Minister will obviously often raise his or her items at the beginning of a cabinet at the UK level. And then you'll have the business report, and you get similar things at UK cabinet level. So a lot of those things, the notion of private offices for each individual minister, all of these things derive from a Westminster model.
What about the civil service? How would you describe the differences between the operation of the civil service in Wales and in Westminster, even though it is technically all the same UK civil service?
Well, I think as it has evolved, um, civil servants in Wales have a closer, more direct relationship with ministers as members of the legislature. So, I talk about the fifth floor being the ministerial floor in Wales. Of course, the private offices are all there as well. They will have the television on when their minister is making a statement or is appearing before committee. They'll be monitoring to pick up on any action points that need to be undertaken, so on and so forth. I'm sure the same thing there goes on in Westminster, but you've got a kind of more collective environment. And civil servants have been appearing before assembly committees very early on at a range of different levels, I would say. So I think there's a broader experience of working with the legislature here in Wales than there probably has been in Westminster.
Many people believe, sort of rightly or wrongly, that the civil service is a bit of an immovable object. Minister being someone who just signs off civil service advice. Is to what extent do you think that's true, or have I just been watching too much Yes Minister?
Well, I think Yes Minister, I use it for teaching occasionally. I mean, it's Yes Minister coincided as a program with a growth of cynicism about the politician civil service relationship. You had the Crossman Diaries, for example. You had a series of memoirs from Labour ministers, former Labour ministers who'd been in the 74, 79 government, Tony Benn's diaries, articles written by Michael Meacher, Gerald Kaufman's How to Be a Minister book, which kind of opened up that discussion about the potential tensions between politicians and civil servants, ministers and civil servants, and their ways of operating. And sometimes that still goes on, I think. I mean, I do think that, I mean, essentially what's happening is this. The civil service is an institution with a life beyond any one government. It has a stewardship role. The stewardship role has not been respected very well, I would say, in recent years, since 2016. It's been undermined by a tax on the blob, as some UK government ministers have called it. But it has that stewardship role. It has a role beyond the life of any one government. So it's an institution. It's a permanent institution. Permanent secretary is called permanent for a reason. Ministers are coming in with an activist mindset and an activist agenda. And there is an inevitable tension between an institution and people coming in with an activist mindset. It's just going to happen, regardless of whether there are conspiracies or particular ways of working. So I think that's a kind of natural issue of organizational dynamics, if you like.
So looking ahead a little bit, after the next Senedd election, there's a very likely scenario that we enter into where that institution will almost permanently be in a state of coalition. What advice could you give on the basis of the work you've done to ministers that are going to be operating in coalition government?
Well, in a sense, Wales has quite a lot of experience of coalition, firstly. You've never had a majority for one party in the institution. The largest size it's had is 30 members out of 60, the Labour Party. So there's always been a need to find a compromise on policy areas, on the budget, on other things, and to try and take somebody or some people from other parties with you. So that I think built into the system in Wales is that assumption that you've got to find ways to cooperate to a lesser or greater degree. And when the coalition, the UK Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition, was formed in 2010, there were people certainly on the Liberal Democrat side, such as Jim Wallace, of course, going into the UK government, who've had experience of a coalition arrangement in Scotland. So they had something to offer. And I think UK governments have had to learn from the devolved experience in this. But to directly answer your question, I think these are the realities that are quite common in continental Europe, in many different countries. And it is about knowing really what are the red lines in your manifesto that you really want to hold on to and what you're prepared to negotiate around. I mean, certainly we took the view in 2007, 2011 that we got most of our manifesto into the One Wales agreement and got most of that through. And then there are things that arise in the course of a parliament or a government that you then have to adapt to, which have not been covered. So I think there's a willingness to talk together. We've seen the willingness to talk together even when it's not gone as far as a coalition, in the sense of, there have been partnership agreements, there have been agreements on specific issues, there have been agreements on a budget. All of those things have happened. So I think Wales, amongst the political parties now, has a huge amount of experience in it.
Would be remiss of me not to ask your thoughts about the current going on with Welsh Government. What do you think the Welsh Government need to do to sort of reverse this tide of opinion that seems to be going against them?
Can you be more specific?
Well, I think there's two elements to this question. We'll take the less controversial one first, probably, which is there seems to be a number of unpopular decisions made by the Welsh Government in the last few years. I think we can all think of 20 mile an hour as a major one, but it seems to have been making decisions that have turned public opinion against them. And then there is, of course, the well-polled unpopularity of the current Welsh Labour leader and First Minister Vaughan Gething. So you can take that in whichever order you would like, Leighton.
Well, let me just start on the policy front. If you look at the 20 mile an hour policy, this was grossly misrepresented by the opposition, let me say. The idea was there was a blanket ban on speeds above 20 miles an hour in Wales. And this was promoted by their friends at Westminster and in particular conservative-leaning newspapers. Now, against that, I would say perhaps the Welsh Government could have sold that policy better. But the policy itself I don't think now we're whatever we are, a year on from it. Uh, it seems to have had an impact. We know that average speeds have come down. People have got used to the fact that actually there are plenty of roads on which they can drive at more than 20 miles an hour. And increasingly, we are seeing research evidence about the impact of 20 mile an hour limits, not just in Wales, but beyond Wales as well. So, there was a considerable reaction to that policy, there's no question. Whether it was warranted, well, I think we're well beyond it. I think that one will bed down. It'll become part of the way we do things in our day-to-day lives. And I think people will get less exercised about it on the whole. Although I'm sure there'll be one or two political parties that want to stir it up. Um, you wanted to talk about the Welsh Labour leadership. I think Welsh Labour is in a very difficult position. The reality is that things seem to get worse every week rather than better. I don't think they've been able to draw a line under the issues, and each week something new seems to happen, or something new seems to get said, which makes the situation even worse. So I think people were in Welsh Labour were immensely disciplined during the general election. You had the no confidence vote at the beginning, but after that, they showed immense discipline over the issue, and concentrated on the campaign. Subsequently, we had that very dramatic statement last week by Hannah Blything, and there've been a whole series of questions on the back of that. The other issue around the donations doesn't seem to quieten down. If anything, other developments have arisen in relation to that. And I think Welsh Labour is in a very difficult position at the present time.
Where do we go from here?
Well, I mean, let me answer that in a number of parts. I mean, I think first of all, what happens really depends, it seems to me, on two poles of power. The first is, does there come a point where Labour at Westminster thinks that this has gone on too long and it is distracting from their agenda on, for example, public standards? So that's one pole of power. And the other is the pole of power in the Labour group in the Senedd and the Labour members of the cabinet. There are some people who are in the cabinet who've been brought in by Vaughan Gething. They are going to be more likely to support him. There are others who support, and some of those supported him were already in the cabinet and supported him in the election. There are others who supported Jeremy Miles. Now, I don't think this can be a comfortable time for anybody in the cabinet at present. I'm sure it's not a comfortable time for Vaughan Gething either. And I don't think myself that the current position is sustainable.
I'm going to take a thread from what you said there, which is about the sort of interrelationships of Labour parties at either end of the M4. With the election of a Labour government at Westminster, do you have any fears for the future of clear red water? Do you think policy convergence between those two governments are now inevitable?
I think that's the wrong question. I mean, I think clearly red water is a distracting phrase because it's kind of there are too many assumptions about what
Yes,
it
of course,
is.
yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about policy convergence and divergence for a minute. There was actually quite a lot of policy convergence between Labour at Westminster and Labour in Wales on certain issues, such as skills training for young people. You may remember that when the UK Labour government fell in 2010, it had had something called, it had had a jobs programme, which we then adopted in Wales to get young people back into work. We carried on with the programme. We renamed it, we slightly repositioned it, but it was very similar to what had been in operation, for example, under the Labour government before that at a UK level. We carried on with education maintenance allowances in Wales when the coalition government phased them out, for example. So a number of things where there was very clear policy convergence in any case. There were differences. Wales was certainly far less enamoured of private finance initiatives than the UK Labour government. The choice agenda in Wales did not operate at all in the same way in health. We did not have academies in Wales in the education system. So, I mean, there were very clear differences. I don't see any reason why those kind of things would change or whether there should be any forced convergence between Wales and Westminster. Where I think there are likely to be tensions, we've already seen one of those in the justice area, policing and justice, if you like. I think there may be tensions, and this would concern me as well, on the post-European funding programme. And these are obvious ones. And we wait and see on the wider constitutional agenda. We'll wait and see what Keir Starmer does in respect of the House of Lords, for example. I mean, we'll get the King's speech later this week. But sorry, but I'm speaking on Monday, the 15th of July. So people, I don't know when this is going out, but anyway. And the Labour manifesto, for example, talks about establishing a second chamber of the nations and regions as an aspiration. So that's still there on the agenda, but there are going to be tensions. And the Welsh Government is not going to be in a position where it can spend its time blaming the UK government for the lack of resources. That's very obvious. So I think there are going to be tensions to be resolved, and they've got, these are early days for the UK government. They've got to find a way of working these tensions out.
Do you think that the minute the Welsh Government is strong enough to push back against any forced policy convergence?
Again, how do you force policy convergence? They can't force policy convergence in evolved areas.
I phrase that poorly. So if, for example, pressure were to come upon the Welsh Government for making a decision that was different from the taken by the UK government in the UK or in England, do you think that the pressure would get to them to the extent that they would change their tack? I think we've already seen this with HS2 now, where the Welsh Government have recalculated the figure they're using to say that they were owed by the Barnett consequentials of HS2.
Well, I mean, the history of devolution in the period 1999 to 2010 was that a lot of issues were resolved not through formal governmental structures like the Joint Ministerial Committee, but on a party basis, people tried to find compromises. But there were clear areas where Wales and the Welsh government, Welsh Assembly government as it was then, and the UK government had a different approach. And I think that will be the case. I think it's unlikely there would be policy convergence just because somebody in London says so.
Finally, can we talk a little bit about your Substack? Welcome to Ukania. What have you been trying to achieve with it?
Two things, really. One, on the broader kind of front, Ukania to me is a useful term to describe the UK after Brexit. I borrowed it obviously from Tom Nairn. I don't agree with everything that Tom Nairn wrote, and I've been quite critical of him in the past. But I think it's about the UK is a state trying to transition from having been in Europe, no longer in Europe. Lots of quite complicated unresolved historical relationships. So I wanted to write about those. I also wanted to write about some of the things that are in the book, some of the other academic things I published. I'll probably write about tech regulation, technology policy, and those things as well, drawing on what I wrote about Facebook in a previous book. And then on the other side, I'm preparing the ground for the next book, which is on the Government of Wales, the making of the Government of Wales since '99. And so I'm laboriously at the moment going through the Welsh Government Cabinet minutes, which I don't think anybody's done before, mainly because they wouldn't have been able to find them because the links didn't work. And I'm very grateful, I've had quite a lot of support from Mark Drakeford in trying to get the archives sorted, and he's been in touch with National Archives as well about, and tried to sort out the Welsh Government deposit of materials to National Archives. But the moment I'm concentrating on the digital side of things, and I'm therefore going year by year from the year 2000 to I will catch up with contemporary era sometime next year. I'll get to 2025. when those minutes start to be published. We're still waiting for the cabinet minutes of Alan Michael's era to be published, 99 to 2000. They have been promised for several years, but and Alan has no objection to them being published, by the way. But they've not yet been published, and I'll go back and take a look at those when they come out. But it's interesting doing it. It gives you quite an insight into some developing areas of policy over the long term, particularly sustainable development, future generations, but also education policy, health policy, constitutional policy, and so on. So that's an undertaking which, I can't pretend it's going to raise people's blood pressure on the whole or excite people a lot, but there are people who are interested in it and are raising interesting questions with me about it.
I'm going to be one of those people because that to me sounds brilliant. Anyway, going back to what you've been writing about, I think this is very germane at the moment, but you've written a lot about toxic leadership, the rise of populism, blame avoidance, the fight for better standards. You've spent a lot of time focusing on Boris Johnson, unsurprisingly. Do you feel like we've turned a corner on that front, or do you think we should be cautious that there's more of that on the horizon?
I think we should be cautious, but I think there have been some very good statements in the first week by Keir Starmer. Public service is a privilege. He met on his first day with the independent advisor on ministerial ethics, the Prime Minister, and has said subsequently that he wants the independent advisor to be able to launch investigations off his own bat, which is a long-standing recommendation of the Committee of Standards in Public Life and the Public Administration Committee in the House of Commons. So that was good to see. So we're seeing some very important early moves, I think. But this is an area where you have to be eternally vigilant, in my view. And there's been such an erosion of public standards, particularly since Brexit, in which the media has played a big role. Basically, the media, certain sections of the media have essentially taken the view that public standards breaches are all right if it's one of our people doing it. And there used to be a much wider consensus about standards in public life than that.
Leighton Andrews, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. If people want to hear more from you, where can they find you on social media and the like?
Well, they can find me, Leighton Andrews, on Twitter, as I still insist on calling it, and ukania.substack.com.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Leighton.
Thank you.
Obviously, I recorded that episode of Hiraeth the night before 3 Welsh Government cabinet ministers and the Council General all submitted their resignation letters, followed an hour or so later by Vaughan Gething announcing that he was going to step down as First Minister as soon as a new Welsh Labour leader was elected and a new First Minister was appointed. When we recorded the pod, I had no knowledge that anything was happening, no direct knowledge at all. Though obviously having seen the interview that on the afternoon we were recording the podcast that Jeremy Miles had undertaken with ITV Wales, where he had felt unable to give his wholehearted support to Vaughan Gething, it certainly felt that something must be on the move. A week or so on, we are now in a position where it looks like my good friend, my very old friend, Eluned Morgan, whom I campaigned with in 1997 in the referendum to get the Yes for Wales campaign, is likely to be elected unopposed as leader of Welsh Labour and subsequently as First Minister, meaning that Wales will have its first ever woman First Minister, and not before time. I wrote a blog last week about the importance of principled resignations. They do matter. And it was clear that the situation could not go on. As I hinted at in the podcast as we recorded it, I felt the situation was untenable. Things have moved on. As I record this on Tuesday, 23rd of July, this voice note, it looks very likely that we will soon have a new First Minister in Eluned, and I'll be delighted to see her become First Minister. As I say, she is an old friend, and I've worked with her on many occasions over the last 25 years or so. I think she'll be a breath of fresh air. She has that unique combination of knowing working class Wales well, having grown up in Ely and Cardiff, and what is often thought to be one of the largest council estates in Europe. But she's also been immersed in the Welsh language from her earliest days and grew up speaking the language. And she obviously has a considerable international commitment as well. And I look forward to seeing how things develop. Let's just watch this space.
Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.